Here's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about managing your mostly federal student loan repayment, but also some other considerations that can impact the repayment option that you select. And also the balancing act that we've been talking about. If you have different types of debt, maybe federal student loans, private student loans, maybe credit cards now, but then down the road, you might want to buy a car or buy a home. And then you also have to think about, gosh, I need to start saving and potentially investing. How do I balance all of these things out? So we just want to kind of set the foundation for that and discuss that, and certainly answer any additional questions you might have about those topics. And so this is the balancing act that we've been talking about, right? So right now, you may have student loan debt, again, private and federal student loan debt. You might have credit card debt. Down the road, you might be thinking, gosh, I have to buy a vehicle. What's sort of involved in that? And maybe 5-10 years down the road, I want to buy a home. And again, saving and investing, different types of savings that you have to take into consideration, different types of investments that are also opportunities for you to take advantage of. And how does it all apply? And it really breaks down to opportunity costs. And we know about opportunity costs, right? If you make one decision, you can't do another. That applies to finances as well. We have limited resources for the most part, right? Limited resources. And we have to figure out how to apply those resources. For generally speaking, we want to maximize our financial picture. And so we want to have our money work for us, and we want to make smart decisions around our money and how we spend our money and how we pay down our debt and how we invest in our futures. And these are all very important things to keep in mind as you prepare for that next step in your life, career, managing these obligations. Yeah, well, it depends. So it depends on the credit card. So just paying the minimum balance on a credit card, that's how a pizza can turn into a $200 pizza. If you think about paying just the minimum over time with interest on a credit card, which can be 12, 15, 20%. I mean, these are high interest. That's how typical items that you put on a credit card become very, very expensive over time. In terms of your credit score, that really depends. You always need to pay the minimum balance by the date that it's due, because one of the most important factors in determining your credit is your payment history and making sure that you're paying your bills on time. The second most important factor, however, is the amount that you owe on your debts and essentially your utilization ratio of those debts. So if you're creeping toward your credit limit, so you're not making your payments, or if you're making the minimum payment, you're continuing to add money purchases, on that credit card, and you're upping your balance. If you're starting to creep toward your credit limit, that can have a negative impact on your credit score. So financially, not only is it important or in your best interest to pay more than the minimum balance, also it can impact your credit score if you do that as well, generally speaking. Yeah. So not all debt is bad. There are good types of debt, or better, let's say better types of debt, because debt just generally feels uncomfortable, right? But there are better types of debt, and then there are worse types of debt. Now, I don't think there's anything more important than investing in yourself through education. And so for a number of reasons, education loans can be considered good debt. There are also some benefits associated with education loans. We talked about some of the repayment benefits that are associated with federal student loans. There are also some tax deductions that you can take advantage of. So, for example, on your federal tax return, there's up to $2,500 tax deduction that you can take on the interest that you pay when you start repaying on your loans, the interest that you repay on any qualifying loans. That can technically include federal and private student loans. If it's over $600, you're going to get a 1098E from your lender around tax season. So you'll know, all right, what do I put in that box on my tax form? But there are tax benefits. There's a deduction that decreases your income essentially for paying that interest. There are benefits certainly to having federal student loans. beyond the fact that you're investing in your education, which obviously is going to help you experience a higher income over your lifetime compared to others that don't. But there are other types of good debt the other types of debt that can be considered better debt too, right? So example, a mortgage to help you buy a home, or to help you invest in a business. Over time, typically we experience increases in real estate, right? Let's kind of forget what happened in 2008 and 2009. Over a long period of time, that's an investment in yourself in terms of equity. And same thing, with a business asset as well, a loan that you might borrow to help you fund your own or start your business. Bad types of debt, a general rule of thumb is a debt that doesn't help you experience any equity or an increase in value over time. Anybody ever heard, like, the moment that you buy a car, you drive it off the lot, the value depreciates by like 20 to 30%? Yeah, car loans, typically automobile loans, is typically not a good debt. That's why I hate spending money on cars. I'm never going to get any money back from that, right? I'm always going to lose money over time. I'll drive my car until the wheels fall off for that reason. Credit card debt too, or other types of consumer debt. Let's talk about, when you go to the store, you put a shirt on a credit card, right? If you don't pay that off immediately and interest is accrued on that, you're going to pay more for that shirt the following month or the month after until you pay that off. That's not considered a good type of debt. When talking about additional considerations, and just really quick here, when you're starting to figure out your plan post-graduation, you first have to figure out what your income is going to be, and not your gross salary, right? Because what happens to your salary? Taxes, right? You have to start with that net value, what you're bringing home, and then you can start to figure out your budget and determine what your fixed expenses are first, and then after that, add in the wants, which are the discretionary items. The thing about federal student loans in your budget is to remember that those have already happened. You have to factor those into your budget first before you consider anything else. Where you're going to live, what kind of car that you're going to drive, how many roommates you might have to have, where can you, based on location, where can you afford to live? The loans have already happened, or if you're in your senior year, they've already happened. They may not have happened for everybody yet, but when you're figuring out your budget and you're preparing to graduate, you have to factor in the loans first, right? And then you can figure out other areas of your budget and where you can allocate those resources. But you also need to factor in short-term and long-term goals. Maybe a short-term goal is, I really need to establish a emergency savings, because I don't have emergency savings. So you need to establish that. Or maybe a short-term goal is, I need to reduce my credit card debt because my interest rate's high, and it makes me sick to think about the interest that I'm paying on that debt. Maybe a long-term goal is, I need to purchase a vehicle, or in 10 years I want to buy a home, so I need to set money aside for a down payment for that. So factoring all of those in as kind of a starting point to figure out this balancing act. This is kind of the place that you want to start. Now, here are the different repayment options that are available to you. And again, these are federal direct loans. So Perkins loan is going to be set up differently. You're going to pay the institution back for those, or whoever they may have contracted with to manage that process. Private loans, you pay the lender back based on the terms associated with that loan program when you borrowed it. But with the federal direct loans, and this is true for both undergraduate and graduate level, like the Grad Plus loans, if you borrow those loans, you can select from one of these options for the most part. There's some eligibility criteria for some of them, but for the most part, you have access to these plans, and you can decide you start out, maybe one payment plan works well for you, but then the following year, the next year, it doesn't any longer, so you can switch if you're not locked into these, which is great. Now, if you didn't do anything upon graduation, if you did nothing at all, if you didn't select a payment plan, you would be set up in the standard repayment plan, which means that the total amount that you've borrowed, principal plus interest, is divided by 120 payments. And you pay the same amount every single month for 10 years, and then you're done. Now, aside from writing a check to pay off all your loans when you leave school, this is the most cost-effective way to do it. You're going to pay the least amount of interest over time, because you're going to be paying over 10 years versus extending it out a little bit longer compared to some of these other repayment plans. Now, also keep in mind that there are no prepayment penalties on federal student loans. So if you, let's say, you get more than you need for a graduation presents, monetary graduation presents, so you want to put a couple $1,000s down on your loans, there's no prepayment penalty for doing that. Or, let's say, in this example here, based on $50,000 in federal student loans. Now, you may not have borrowed this much. You may have borrowed more than this, but just so that we're consistent here and giving like an average, debt level, we wanted to kind of keep it consistent. So we just selected $50,000 for demonstration purposes. But in this particular plan, $50,000 is $575 per month for 10 years. Now, if you wanted to cut down on the total amount of time that you're paying on your loans and interest, you could pay $600 or you could pay $650 a month, and that's going to reduce the amount the time that you're paying plus the total amount that you've paid back. So no prepayment penalties, always important to keep in mind if you ever get a windfall or if you want to pay a little bit more per month. So standard, the most cost-effective way to do that compared to any of the other repayment plans. The minimum payment is $50. The next one is a graduated repayment plan. So you may say, all right, the standard doesn't quite work for me. I want to start out at a little bit lower monthly payment. You have the ability to do that through the graduated repayment plan. And this one is kind of set up on the premise that over time, as time goes on, you're probably going to see an increase in your income. That's typically true. Over a 10-year period, people typically experience increase in income over time. So this is kind of designed to take that into consideration. So you start out at a lower monthly payment, and then it usually increases every 2 years. It's set up over 10 years, just like standard repayment. But what's important to consider here, if you look at this option compared to the standard repayment, the monthly payment starts out much lower. It's at $332 compared to standard repayment, which is $575. That looks pretty good, right? But keep in mind, years 9 and 10, the payment balloons up to $996. That's much, much higher than the standard repayment amount of $575. And the interest is a little bit higher, because even though it's still 10 years, you're paying a lower amount on the principal, so more interest accrues over the life of that 10-year period, The next one is extended repayment. So this is only available to borrowers who have over $30,000 in federal student loans. So you have to have at least $30,001 in federal student loans, and then you are eligible for extended repayment. Now, extended repayment can extend your repayment time up to 25 years. And you can select either extended fixed or extended graduated. Extended fixed, monthly payments exactly the same for 25 years. Extended graduated, similar to graduated up here, is going to increase over the life of the loan. So here's the thing to keep in mind with extended. Let's look at the total interest paid here. So again, this is based off all of these plans are based off $50,000 at a 6.8% interest. It's a little bit higher than what you've borrowed when you borrowed this year. But $50,000 with these plans, because you extend it up to 25 years, extend these to 25 years, the total interest paid is so much higher than what we see under the standard and graduated plan. So the total cost of these loans is pretty significant. Now, what you could do, again, remember, you could set up an extended plan if you have over $30,000 in student loans, and then just say, well, I know I don't have to pay more than $347 a month, but I'm going to pay $500. Because I can't afford $575, but I can do $500. And then you pay that off a little bit earlier than the 25 years. It takes discipline to do that, though, right? It takes discipline. But with today you can set up automatic payments from your checking account to make it really easy. But again, keep in mind that's an option that you do have. And then the next one Actually, I'm going to move to income-based repayment. This is a newer repayment option that is, it's an income-driven. There are actually 3 different income-driven repayment options that you can borrow or that you can take advantage of. Essentially what they do is they take your adjusted gross income and they compare that to the poverty level of the state that you live in, and they take a percentage of that, divide that by 12, and that's your monthly payment. You do have to be eligible for a partial financial hardship in order to be eligible for this program. All that really means, a partial financial hardship, we'll go into what the details are in just a minute, but a partial financial hardship essentially means that your payments under income-based repayment have to be lower than what they would be under a standard repayment plan. If that's the case, then you're eligible to take advantage of income-based repayment. So this is how the payment works. And again, you don't have to memorize this, but you can, because you can throw numbers into a calculator to figure this out. But what they do is they take your adjusted gross income, and then from that they subtract 150% of the poverty guidelines based on your household size and where you live, and then they take 15% of that. 15% of that is then divided by 12. That's your monthly payment under income-based repayment. Now, the thing to keep in mind with income-based repayment, and that's why you see this right here, is that the monthly payment each year can change based on your income. And as you experience higher salaries, your income is going to go up. So the monthly payment is set for the year, and then you apply again, or you don't have to really apply again, but you have to forward along documentation to your servicer, and then they run the calculations again, and they come up with your new annual payment. Now, under income-based repayment, your payment will never be higher than standard repayment. So if you ever are in a position where you experience, a significant jump in your income, it won't ever be higher than what it would have been under the standard repayment. So you don't have to worry about it kind of ballooning up. Yeah.
Is there still a prepayment option?
Yeah, you can always, regardless of the payment plan that you select, you can always prepay with no penalty. You can always, so you could do this, plan and then pay more if you want to. Under income-based repayment, your minimum payment could potentially be zero. You're not required, depending on how the calcs work out. You might not be required to actually make a payment. It could be zero, but you're still considered in good standing according to your repayment plan. The other thing about income-based repayment is that after paying through the income-based repayment plan for 25 years, if you have a remaining balance at that time, it's forgiven. Taxable, it's a taxable event, but it will be considered as income essentially. The amount that's forgiven will be considered income the following year, but it is forgiven. So you'd have a zero balance after 25 years if you stay in this plan. Now, you may not make it to 25 years depending on your income. So that's a consideration too. But that's currently the way that the program is set up right now. Any questions about that? Now there's a newer one. It's called Pay As You Earn. Pay As You Earn, almost the exact same thing as income-based repayment, although instead of 15% of your discretionary income, using the calculation that I mentioned before, it's 10%. And after 20 years of repaying, the remaining balance is forgiven. So it's almost exactly the same except for those two distinctions. Well, there's another distinction too. The eligibility pool is a little bit smaller for Pay As You Earn. You can't have an outstanding loan balance prior to 2007, October 1 of 2007, and you have to have had a direct loan disbursement after October of 2011. But most people here probably fit within that range. So you could potentially be eligible for Pay As You Earn. Also, as long as the loans are through the direct loan program. That's important too. We've already talked a little bit about this, but again, for both of those plans, you do have to demonstrate partial financial hardship, which means that, we won't go through these calculations, but essentially means that your payment has to be lower than what your payment would be through a standard repayment plan. And if that's the case, then you're eligible for those. The other one is income contingent. Now, this is a plan that's only eligible for direct loan borrowers, and it's similar considerations, an income-driven repayment program. You don't have to demonstrate partial financial hardship. The calculations are a little bit different. You could see that here it's the difference between, or it's the lesser of either 20% of your discretionary income or what you would repay on a repayment plan, fixed payment over the course of 12 years. So the lesser of those two. The thing with an income contingent plan that's a little bit different from like income-based repayment is that the payments can potentially be higher than what they would be under like income or than a standard repayment plan. So it can potentially be higher than that. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you about the different repayment plans, and there are a lot of nuances between each of these. The most important thing to understand is that you have options. You have options. And you also want to contact your servicer because they have folks who can talk with you about what option might work well for you. So I just want you to have a general understanding between these different repayment plans so that you can maybe ask the right types of questions. Like, do you think an income-driven repayment plan might work well for me? And if that's the case, what would my payment look like under these repayment plans? That's the most important thing, is to know that you have options so that when you get that bill from your servicer and it's set up for a 10-year standard repayment plan and you say, ouch, I can't manage that, we just want you to know that there are other options out there available to you to help you successfully navigate this process. Consolidation. So there was a question about consolidating, and so we want to talk a little bit about that. Consolidation used to be all the rage, and that's because the way that interest rates used to be calculated, they used to actually change year to year, and so when you consolidated, you locked in an interest rate. Consolidation was also all the rage before they had some of these income-driven repayment programs that allowed you to extend your repayment over 20 or 25 years. And so if you had a significant amount of loan debt, it allowed you to extend up to 30 years so that you could have a smaller monthly payment. But now, because of the income-driven repayment programs, consolidation might not be a benefit to you. So consolidation isn't a repayment option, it's actually a new loan. It's actually a loan. So what you're doing when you consolidate your loans, you're paying off all of your federal loans and you're putting them into one new loan. And the interest rate is a weighted average that takes into consideration the loans that you've borrowed and the interest rate that they're at. So if you have if some loans have a much lower interest rate, it could by consolidating, it could potentially raise the interest rate that you pay, and so over time it could be a more costly option. So just something to consider. You may want to consider consolidating loans if you are in a situation, and again, the department tries to prevent this from happening. They try to keep all your loans together with one servicer. But if you're in a situation where you have multiple servicers and you're paying back multiple people, it might be easier to consolidate those loans so it's one loan to manage. But again, with like automatic checking, it makes it real easy to set these payments up so they go to the right folks and you can kind of put it out of your mind and not deal with it. But another thing that you can do with your servicer is talk to them about, consolidation and whether or not consolidating is an option for you. If you do have Perkins loans, you can consolidate them into in with your federal loans. But the reason why I said you may not want to do that is because there are some benefits associated with Perkins loan, and specifically some forgiveness options. Once you consolidate those in, it's really not a Perkins loan anymore. It's a federal direct loan. They're not eligible for those options and forgiveness options any longer. So, and for information on some of the Perkins loan forgiveness options that are out there, the website studentloans.gov is a great resource. So moving on to forgiveness options, because this is kind of a hot topic. How can we reduce the amount of debt that we have other than paying it off? There are some programs out there, and one of those that gets a lot of attention is public service loan forgiveness. Now, if you're working for a nonprofit organization, the next slide has specific details about that. But a nonprofit working in public service, essentially, then after making 120 for working full-time, making 120 qualifying payments, then you can have the remaining balance forgiven. And what's cool about this, unlike income-based repayment, it's not a taxable event. So there wouldn't be taxes associated with that. So something certainly to take into consideration. So 120 payments, so essentially 10 years of payments while you're working full-time at an eligible organization, then the remaining balance is forgiven. You want to check for other sources, such as your potential employer. They may have loan forgiveness programs. Maybe it's only for federal loans. Maybe you do private too, though. So you want to exhaust all potential resources to help you pay these off. The ones that we're talking about right now are specifically for related to federal loans. But when you get those offers from your employers and you're looking at benefit packages, these are great questions to be asking. There may also be some repayment or forgiveness options available through specifically through the state that you are a resident of. So you want to take a look at that as well. So there's a little bit more in terms of eligibility for the public service loan forgiveness. So these are the types of employment that will be eligible: a governmental organization, not-for-profit, 501c3, private not-for-profit organization. So generally speaking, those are the categories which are considered eligible employment under public service loan forgiveness. And then here's some additional resources to help you understand a little bit more about that. But the most important thing is the paperwork, keeping track of the payments that you're making. They have to be on time. You have to be working full time. Stay up to date on regulatory changes. These can change at any time based on acts of Congress. So it's important to understand what's available to you, especially as you're taking these into consideration when you're trying to determine this balancing act, right? And also we have some resources. I mentioned the SALT website before, saltmoney.org, some great resources on forgiveness options. We actually have a book called 60 Ways to Get Rid of Your Student Loan Debt Without Paying It, and it goes through the federal options. It talks about some of the state options that are available as well. There's teacher loan forgiveness, Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, and also, again, you want to check with your employer to find out what's eligible, what's available to you as well. Now, really quickly here, if you ever experience a financial hardship where you can't make payments on your loans, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to contact your servicer and see if a different repayment option is a better fit for you. Because remember what I said before, income-based repayment, your monthly payment can be zero, and you're still technically making good payments in good standing on your loan. So that's the first thing that you do, is check to see if there's another repayment option that works well for you. But if that's not the case, your next step is to see if you're eligible for a deferment or a forbearance, which basically is going to postpone your payments for a certain amount of time. Could be 6 months, could be 12 months. If you've lost a job, if you're experiencing, a financial hardship, talk to them about your options to see if you can postpone payments. You always want to seek a deferment first over a forbearance. One of the biggest differences between these two is that with a deferment, when you're in a period of deferment, you're in one right now, by the way. Which one do you think? In school. In-school deferment. You're in in-school deferment right now. When you're in periods of deferment, you're not responsible for the interest that accrues on subsidized loans. So that's the case too. After you leave school, if you're eligible for any of these other, like military unemployment, you don't pay the interest on the subsidized portion of the loans. You do in a forbearance. So that's why you want to seek this first. Now, I'm not going to spend tons of time on this, but as you can imagine, if you don't make payments on your loans, if they become delinquent, or further down the road, if they go into default, that has a serious impact on your credit and your overall finances. Because if you miss payments, if you miss a couple of payments, you got to catch up. Interest is going to accrue on those, and additional fees. Additional fees can be added. The later you go into delinquency, the harder it is to catch up, the more fees that are going to be tacked on to that becomes very expensive. So again, the worst thing that you can do if you get into trouble is to ignore your obligations and push it under the carpet. You got to reach out for support. You got to reach out for help. I mentioned studentloans.ed.gov, the SALT website, tons of resources, but there are tons of options for you to manage this. So we just want you to know that those are available to you, so you can take it. You should never find yourself into that situation. Now, if you're more than 270 days past due on a federal loan, then it can go into default. Now, default is a serious situation where technically all of your loans at that point become due, and you're no longer eligible for some of the repayment options that we talked about before, and you have to come up with a new plan to pull yourself out of default. It has serious negative implications for your credit, and you can be charged a ton of money in fees on top of that. In addition to that, your wages can be garnished, up to 15% it can be garnished. They can seize your tax refunds if you're expecting a tax refund. It might just not come home because they can take it right away from you if that's a situation. So again, this is severe delinquency going into 270 days past due goes into default. So you don't want to find yourself ever in that situation, but you won't be, because now you know the options that are available to you. So again, going back to this balancing act, we just have a few more minutes. So it may seem, so you're talking about like your overall debt and figuring out how to manage that. So actually, let me go back here for a second. It may seem crazy to put money aside and save it, like in a savings account, right, where you're making like what's the average like interest rate on a general savings account? Any ideas? I mean, it can be so tiny, like on a savings account that's tied to like a checking account through a bank. It can be like point something percent. Yeah, tiny, tiny, tiny. A little bit higher if you have an account with its interest bearing, could be like 1% or close to that with some of the online accounts that are available. But small, small, small. And it might seem crazy. Like, why would I save money? Why would I put money into savings that's getting such a low interest rate when I have maybe credit card debt or student loans that are being charged much higher percent, or there's a much higher percentage rate associated with that. And mathematically, it doesn't make sense to put money into a savings account, right? But why would you want to do that? Why would the answer be you still need to do that? Any ideas? I mentioned it before. Emergency fund. What happens when an emergency happens? Because it's never if, it's always when. The tires will fall off eventually of that car that you beat into the ground. So what happens when you drop your transmission or your engine blows or all the tires fall off and you don't have money in an emergency fund? A lot of times people use credit, right, to meet those expenses. And what's the interest rate on your credit card? Could be 12, could be 15, could be 20%. That's a lot higher than probably what your student loans are, right? So you at least need to set money aside for an emergency fund. So as you're figuring out how do I tackle all of this debt, and should I start saving? How much should I start saving? You need to take all of those factors into consideration. The most important thing in terms of saving and investing, first, you have to have the emergency fund set up. When you're in school, if you can have $500, $600 in an emergency fund, that's pretty good. When you get out of school, do you know what the general guidelines are for emergency funds? You may have heard 3 to 6 months of living expenses. 3 to 6 months of living expenses. So again, that's something that you want to be working toward as you're planning for this next transition after school. So yes, even though you're going to be working on whittling down that debt, you also got to start factoring in saving money in your emergency fund. And then once that's established, then you can start thinking about where else am I going to be putting my money that can work a little bit harder for me. So where can I invest this money? It's going to maybe earn a little more or have a higher interest rate associated with it that over the long run is going to grow a little bit. Now for your emergency fund, you want to have it in a pretty safe location. and which you don't have to necessarily worry about volatile markets or anything along those lines, and it has to be easily accessible. So you're probably not going to see tons of return on an emergency savings account, but you have to have it there and readily accessible. And then in terms of paying down debt, there are a couple of philosophies. You may have, again, federal student loans, you may have private student loans, you may have a couple of credit cards. One way to figure out how you tackle the debt is to line all of those up by the interest rate that's associated with those, and then pay off. You always have to make the minimum balance, but throw more money, put more money if you're able to, toward the one with the highest interest rate first. Makes sense. So over time you pay less interest by doing that. So typically speaking, that would be putting more money toward the credit cards to pay down that debt, maybe then private loans, and then federal loans. Typically that would be the way that they would be kind of lined up if associated by credit, by interest rate, sorry. That's one philosophy. Another philosophy, and this works sometimes with like credit cards, you could line the credit cards. I'm saying, okay, now which one do I tackle first? If you have like 3 different credit cards with different amounts and different interest rates, instead of lining it up by interest rates, you could line it up by amount that you owe, or the balance on that, and then tackle the ones with the lowest balance. And the philosophy around that is that it's rewarding to pay off those and have a zero balance. It's like checking things off your to-do list, right? That's empowering, that's rewarding, and it might encourage you to continue paying off your debt. So different ways to tackle it based on different philosophies, and just think about what's going to work for you in terms of your overall strategy. But one of the reasons why it's so important to invest, and again, this is going to be important as you transition into the working world and start your career, and raise your hand if anybody has ever told you, like the person who starts saving at age 40 will never catch up to the person that started saving at like age 25. You heard that? It's really true. Why? Time value of money, yeah, compounding interest. There's a reason why Einstein said it's the 8th wonder of the world. Compounding interest is your friend. Can work for you, can work against you. But it's true, it's really hard to catch up to someone who started saving earlier if you started a little bit later. 2 examples here, both getting to about $1 million at age 65. The person who started at 25, in order to get to $1 million, had to pay $500 a month out of pocket. And again, at age 65, had about $1 million in the bank. This is assuming 6% interest, by the way. Now, the total expense out of pocket over that time was $240,000, and because of interest, it got this person to $1 million. That's pretty cool. Now let's look at the person who started saving at age 40. Still at 6% interest. We haven't changed the interest here. But their monthly out of pocket to get to $1 million was $1,400. And their total out-of-pocket expenses over that period of time was $420,000. And that's just because the time value of money, they didn't have as much time to save, so interest didn't have as much time to accrue and compound. So it's important to, once you have that emergency fund set aside, to start thinking about investing in other ways, in retirement accounts, for example. Now, the best piece of advice that I can give beyond the different repayment options for federal student loans is when you're looking at your benefits package that are being offered to you by employers, take a look at what their matching opportunities are. In the minimum, what you want to do in terms of like your retirement account, first of all, you want to start from day one. As soon as you can start contributing to your account. But in terms of the amount, at the minimum, at least what you want to do is invest what you need to invest in order to get any matching contributions from your employers. And if you don't take advantage of that, it's kind of like giving away free money. It's, I worked for an organization that contributed 11% of your salary into retirement account. That's huge. You don't typically see that. It's a great benefit. And all you had to do was sign up. And there were people that I worked with that had been there for years and just never signed up. And you want to shake them, like, why did you do that? Because they were essentially giving away free money. So at the very least, do what you need to do in order to get the free contributions from your employer, and start early. Even if it's a little bit, over time, it really adds up. It really adds up. So this is also true when you're talking about getting all the way down to zero with debt, right? Interest is also, it can work against you in terms of debt, and paying things off as quickly as you can is going to save you money in the long run. So we talk about $25,000 in debt. If you paid $288 per month, that's not, you're going to pay a total of $9,524 in interest, and that's over 10 years. If you pay 50 extra bucks a month on $25,000, so $338 instead, you've knocked the total time down to 8 years and 1 month, and you're only paying $7,504 in interest. Make sense? So interest works for you when you're saving, works against you when you have debt. So you put more money toward that debt to get down to zero. And you have this in your handout, but here's another example applied here.